Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of like clinical precision.
Right.
You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, well, there it is.
It's very binary. Broken or not broken.
Exactly. It's clean, it's binary. And honestly, it's comforting because we like things to be visible and categorized. But then you step into the world of global economics and planetary health, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely useless.
Oh, completely. It's a completely different scale.
Yeah, we're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. I mean, we feel the symptoms every day, the exhaustion of the modern grind, the low-level anxiety when reading about climate tipping points, or even just that weird lingering guilt of throwing away another single-use plastic container.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Right. But the underlying disease of the system is so massive and complex, it's impossible to put on a single chart.
It really is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. You aren't just looking at a single broken bone. You're looking at a hyper-interconnected nervous system.
Wow, yeah.
And it's composed of global supply chains, human psychology, deep-seated cultural habits, and, of course, hard ecological limits.
So that vague but heavy sense that the way we produce, consume, and live is fundamentally diseased, that is exactly the starting point for our deep dive today.
It's a big one.
It is. We are looking at a highly ambitious, deeply academic manifesto titled The Blueprint for a Peaceful World, version 1.0, specifically the public academic version.
Right.
Now, this document is vast. It tries to map out the entire architecture for a nonviolent, sustainable civilization.
Yeah.
But you're not reading the whole thing today.
No, we'd be here for weeks.
We really would. Instead, we're taking a magnifying glass and zooming in exclusively on one incredibly dense coordinate, item number 25, which is titled Restorative Economy and Sufficiency.
And by isolating this one item, we are essentially walking right into the engine room of their proposed society.
The engine room, I like that.
Yeah, I mean, if the broader manifesto is a blueprint for a new civilization, item 25 is the plumbing, the wiring, the load-bearing walls, and the foundation all rolled into one.
It's doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Exactly. It is a radical reimagining of how money, production, and value actually function at a systemic level.
And for anyone listening who has ever felt just utterly burnt out by the modern treadmill, working constantly to buy things designed to break so you can work more to buy them again, this God experiment is deeply relevant to you.
Oh, absolutely.
It's fundamentally about redefining the word success for the human race. And because this manifesto touches on some massive, highly heated political debates, things like abandoning GDP as a core metric, protecting resources from privatization, totally overhauling corporate accounting, I want to be clear about our goal today.
Right, the ground rules.
Yes, our goal isn't to take a political side. We aren't endorsing this as some utopian cure-all, nor are we tearing it down from a specific ideological camp. We are strictly operating as mechanics today.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Exactly. We're going to take this entirely new type of economic motor apart, lay the pieces on the table, and figure out the mechanics of how the inventors claim it runs.
And the foundational premise of this new motor, really the primary thesis of item 25, begins with the complete rejection of the linear economic model.
Okay, so define linear model for us.
The text defines this as the take, produce, throw away paradigm.
Yay.
We extract resources from the earth, we manufacture a product, use it briefly, and then it goes straight into a landfill. The authors argued that this model is not just flawed, they say it is a mathematical and evolutionary dead end.
I always think of our current economy as a shark.
Yeah.
And that linear model is basically its biology.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah, it has to keep swimming forward to breathe. It requires a constant, uninterrupted intake of new resources and a constant expulsion of waste just to survive. If GDP doesn't grow, the shark starts sinking. We enter a recession, supply chains freeze, and the system begins to collapse.
The shark analogy captures the fatal flaw perfectly, though, because it assumes an infinite ocean of resources and an infinite capacity to absorb waste.
Which we obviously don't have.
Right. On a finite planet, a system requiring infinite geometric growth will eventually consume its host. So to replace it, the manifesto leans heavily into what it calls a restorative economy, or a well-being economy, structured around the concept of the doughnut economy.
Okay, so walk me through the mechanics of this doughnut model. It sounds whimsical, but I know the macroeconomic theory behind it is incredibly rigid.
Very rigid. Yeah, so To understand how they measure success without the shark swimming forward, you have to literally visualize a donut.
Okay, visualizing.
The inner ring, like the hole in the center, represents the social foundation. These are the non-negotiable basics every single human being requires: food, water, healthcare, education, political voice, and equity.
Got it.
The absolute mandate of item 25 is that no human being should fall into the center hole, which represents severe deprivation and poverty.
Sure, I mean, that tracks with standard global development goals since, what, the mid-20th century?
Right.
Lift people out of poverty.
Exactly. But the radical shift is the outer edge of the donut.
The crust.
Right, the crust. That outer crust represents the planetary boundaries. These are the hard, scientific, ecological ceilings. Things like climate change metrics, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, land system change.
Okay.
The goal of the restorative economy is to operate entirely within the dough of the donut. You must provide that comprehensive social foundation for everyone, but you must do it without ever stepping outside the planetary boundaries.
See, diagnosing a broken global supply chain is one thing, but prescribing a cure that doesn't kill the patient is the hard part. The friction here is immense.
It's massive.
Right now, the dominant macroeconomic logic says the only way to lift people out of the center hole of deprivation is through explosive economic growth. I mean, we need massive industrial output. We need factories churning. We need consumption to create jobs and wealth.
That's the current paradigm, yeah.
So if the shark stops swimming, if we deliberately cap our extraction and output to stay under those planetary boundaries,
Yeah.
how does this well-being economy define and measure success?
Well, the manifesto argues that our current definition of success is actually a statistical illusion.
Really? How so?
Because we measure success by gross domestic product, GDP, but GDP makes absolutely no distinction between positive and negative economic activity.
Oh, right.
If a nation builds a hospital, GDP goes up. If an oil spill devastates a coastline and billions of dollars are spent cleaning it up, GDP also goes up. The disaster is categorized as economic growth.
That's so wild when you think about it.
It is. So the restorative economy discards GDP as the primary compass. Success is explicitly measured by systemic health instead.
But systemic health is notoriously hard to quantify on a ledger. I mean, GDP is simple. It's a number. If it goes up 2%, the markets cheer. If it drops 1%, central banks panic. What does a quality of life metric actually look like to an accountant or a policymaker under this new framework?
It requires moving to what's called multi-capital accounting.
Multi-capital.
Yeah. Instead of just measuring financial capital, a well-being economy tracks natural capital, human capital, and social capital.
Okay, so it's a broader scorecard.
Exactly. Imagine a national dashboard where the headline metrics aren't just stock indexes, but they're things like the stability of local soil ecosystems, the reduction in atmospheric carbon, the availability of clean water, and the physical and mental health indicators of the population.
So you're balancing the books across different domains.
Right. If you increase financial wealth but destroy your natural capital to do it, the restorative economic model scores that as a net loss. It's a failure.
That makes intellectual sense, definitely.
Yeah.
But tracking planetary boundaries on a multi-capital spreadsheet means absolutely nothing if the physical things we hold in our hands, our phones, our clothes, our furniture, are still built with a one-way ticket to a landfill.
Oh, absolutely. The accounting is just the map.
Right. That demands a total overhaul of physical engineering. You can't just change the accounting, you have to change the atomic structure of how society is built.
Which is exactly where the abstract economics of item 25 translate into tangible physical design. They introduce a whole suite of production philosophies to replace the linear factory.
Okay, let's get into the physical stuff.
The key concepts here are the cosmolocal approach, biomimicry, and cradle-to-cradle design.
Let's pull apart cosmolocalism first. It sounds like something from a theoretical physics paper, but it's actually a complete inversion of modern supply chain logistics. The text defines it as global design, local production.
Yeah, and to see the contrast, you really have to look at our current hyper-globalized model.
Okay, paint that picture.
We might extract lithium in South America, ship it to a processing facility in Asia, manufacture the battery component in another Asian country, ship it to North America for final device assembly, and then air freight the final consumer product to Europe.
It's dizzying.
It is an incredibly fragile, carbon-heavy web, and it relies entirely on cheap, subsidized fossil fuels to function.
It's optimized for the lowest possible financial cost at the point of origin, completely ignoring the ecological cost of moving heavy atoms across oceans. And as we've seen recently, when one major canal gets blocked or a pandemic hits, the entire global machine just stutters.
Yep, the fragility is exposed.
Suddenly you can't buy a microchip or a bicycle.
Exactly. So cosmolocalism decentralizes the physical aspect of manufacturing while hyperconnecting the intellectual aspect.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
The knowledge, the engineering blueprint, the software code, the design that is shared globally across the internet, it travels as data, which is effectively weightless and can be transmitted with a negligible carbon footprint.
Right.
But the physical object itself is produced locally, using locally sourced materials only at the exact moment it is needed by the end user.
It's like open source software mechanics applied to physical hardware.
That's exactly it.
It's like downloading the blueprint for an agricultural tractor. And instead of ordering a 3-ton machine to be shipped from a factory 5,000 miles away, you take that file to your regional community fabrication hub.
Right, a local makerspace on steroids.
Exactly. They use advanced CNC machines, 3D printers, and local alloys or bioplastics to machine and assemble the tractor right there in your county.
That is the exact mechanism. It strips out the massive logistical tail of the product, but there is a massive intellectual property hurdle here that we really have to address.
Right. I was just thinking about that. If the blueprint for the tractor you shared globally in the commons, who pays the engineers who spent 5 years designing the transmission?
Exactly.
I mean, our current system funds research and development through patents and monopolies. A company spends millions on R&D because they know they have the exclusive right to manufacture and sell that product globally for a massive profit. If knowledge is free, how does cosmolocalism fund the invention of the tractor in the first place?
It requires a major shift toward institutional and community-driven R&D models. It's actually similar to how basic scientific research is often funded today through university grants or public funding.
Okay, so public money.
Public money, but also the manifesto points toward open source bounty systems and collaborative consortiums. Think about how the open source software movement powers massive chunks of the modern internet.
Like Linux or Apache.
Yes, Linux is the perfect example. Companies realize that a shared, robust foundational infrastructure benefits everyone. So cosmolocalism envisions a world where municipalities, agricultural co-ops, and regional governments pool their resources to fund the open source hardware designs they all need.
Oh, I see. So you don't pay a premium for the intellectual property of the tractor. You pay for the local labor and local materials to instantiate it.
Exactly. The design is a public good.
Okay, so we've solved the shipping problem by moving data instead of atoms. But if I download that blueprint and 3D print my open source tractor out of toxic, non-degradable petrochemical plastics in my local town, I haven't actually solved the planetary boundary problem.
Not at all.
I've just moved the pollution source closer to my own backyard.
Which is why cosmolocalism is functionally useless without the next mandate in item 25, biomimicry and cradle-to-cradle design.
Oh, they have to work together.
They absolutely do. The manifesto strictly mandates that human manufacturing must learn from and mimic nature.
Because in nature, the concept of a landfill literally does not exist.
It's a human invention.
Right. There is no such thing as waste. The exhaust or byproduct of one biological system is the essential, life-giving fuel for another. The fallen leaves of a tree aren't trash. They are the nutrient base for the soil microbiome, which feeds the fungi, which process minerals to support the tree's root system. It is a continuous, perfectly closed loop.
Cradle-to-cradle design applies that strict biological reality to human engineering. The linear economy is cradle-to-grave. A product is born in a factory and dies in a dump.
Right.
Under cradle-to-cradle, the grave becomes the new cradle. The manifesto insists that sustainability must be the absolute default setting of civilization, not a premium luxury feature you pay extra for.
Walk me through the actual logistics of that.
Yeah.
How does a designer create the afterlife of a complex machine, like a blender or a smartphone?
Well, a cradle-to-cradle product has to be engineered from its inception to be fully disassembled.
Okay.
It requires dividing all materials into two strict categories: biological nutrients and technical nutrients.
Biological nutrients being things that can literally decompose.
Yes, materials that can safely return to the soil without introducing any toxins. Bioplastics derived from algae or corn, natural fibers, untreated woods.
Right.
When you're done with the biological nutrient component, it essentially goes into a municipal composting system to regenerate the soil.
And technical nutrients. Because you can't grow a microchip out of algae. We still need rare earth metals, silicon on advanced polymers.
Right, so technical nutrients are high-quality synthetic or mined materials that do not belong in the soil, but they can be infinitely recycled without a loss in structural integrity.
Okay. Infinitely recycled.
The engineering challenge is that current products are monstrous hybrids.
What do you mean by that?
We glue toxic batteries to glass screens and plastic casings in a way that makes separating them economically impossible.
Oh, like when a screen is glued to the frame and you shatter it trying to fix it?
Exactly. A cradle-to-cradle smartphone would be assembled using reversible adhesives or mechanical fasteners. When it breaks, the local fabrication hub snaps it apart. The glass goes back into the technical cycle to become new glass. The precious metals are cleanly extracted. The bioplastic casing is composted. Zero waste.
It fundamentally changes the relationship we have with materials.
Yeah.
I mean, you aren't really buying a phone. You're just temporarily leasing those technical nutrients until they need to be reconfigured into something else.
That is the ultimate horizon the text sets for these design philosophies, the creation of a positive-sum civilization.
Positive sum, as opposed to our current zero-sum extraction.
Right.
In a zero-sum game, if one party wins, another must lose. If I want lumber to build a house, the forest ecosystem must lose so the human economy can win.
Exactly. The restorative economy argues that through biomimicry and cradle-to-cradle engineering, human activity can actually become a regenerative force.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. Imagine a manufacturing facility that treats its own wastewater so effectively that the water leaving the factory is actually cleaner than the water entering it.
Wow.
Or buildings designed with materials that actively scrub carbon from the atmosphere. It breaks the zero-sum mindset, and it allows human communities and ecological systems to win simultaneously.
Okay, the engineering architecture is brilliant. I can really visualize the localized 3D printing hubs, the biodegradable casings, the infinite recycling loops.
It's very compelling.
But there is a massive psychological bottleneck here that technology alone cannot fix.
Human nature.
Yes, human nature. You can engineer the most perfect, infinitely recyclable open source smartphone in the world, but if the population still possesses an insatiable, burning psychological desire to constantly consume, if I demand a new phone every 6 months, purely for the dopamine hit of unboxing it, the energy requirements of that system will still crash the planetary boundaries. You can't out-engineer human greed.
You're completely right. And the manifesto anticipates this exact vulnerability. Technological innovation without cognitive and cultural evolution is completely insufficient. You need a profound shift in the human operating system.
And that bridges us perfectly into the cultural and psychological pillars of item 25. The text introduces a specific philosophical concept to address this: aparigraha.
Yes, aparigraha.
It's an ancient term, but they apply it directly to modern macroeconomics.
They do. Aparigraha originates from ancient Indian philosophy, featuring really heavily in Jainism and the yogic traditions. The closest English translations are non-acquisitiveness, non-possessiveness, or freedom from greed. In the context of this blueprint, aparigraha is positioned as a cultural imperative to embrace what they call reasonable sufficiency.
Reasonable sufficiency.
Yeah.
They set that up as the direct antidote to the race of consumption. But I have to push back here a little bit on behalf of the listener.
Please do.
Because in a modern hyper-capitalist world where our entire social structure, our status, our identity is intertwined with what we own, reasonable sufficiency sounds remarkably like forced poverty or asceticism.
It can sound that way, yes.
If a governing body tells a population, hey, stop wanting things, learn to be happy with less, historically, that breeds massive resentment.
Yeah.
How does the manifesto frame aparigraha as a positive evolution rather than a draconian restriction?
It's a really vital critique. If it is perceived as deprivation, it will absolutely fail.
Right.
But the manifesto frames aparigraha not as poverty, but as cognitive liberation.
Cognitive liberation?
Yeah, it's about reclaiming autonomy.
Autonomy from what? From advertising.
Autonomy from manufactured discontent. Think about it. The linear economy cannot survive on people buying only what they need. It requires you to feel perpetually inadequate so that you will buy the next iteration of a product just to feel temporarily complete.
Right, the upgrade cycle.
Exactly. The advertising industry is essentially an engine designed to generate anxiety and dissatisfaction. Your time, the finite hours of your life, is being traded for wages to satisfy desires that were externally implanted in your psyche.
Ah, I see. So if you are constantly on the treadmill of consumption running just to keep up with the changing trends, you aren't really a free actor.
Right. The text suggests that by embracing reasonable sufficiency, the individual steps off that treadmill. Once the inner ring of the donut is secure, once you have housing, food, healthcare, and security, the data clearly shows that accumulating more physical goods does not correlate with an increase in baseline happiness.
It just correlates with more maintenance, more debt, more stress.
Yeah. Exactly. Aparigraha is a realization that you are freeing yourself from the obligation to constantly acquire. It's basically the decluttering of the human mind at a civilizational level.
It shifts the mindset from, I am denying myself this luxury, to, I am protecting my time and my mental bandwidth from this unnecessary burden.
Beautifully put.
And that cultural shift is deeply tied to how item 25 handles the concept of ownership, specifically regarding the common good. The text mandates the protection of common resources from privatization.
Yes, the commons. This is where the cultural psychology of Aparigraha meets structural economics.
But anytime we talk about the commons in economics, we immediately run into the tragedy of the commons. It's one of the most famous economic theories out there.
Of course, Hardin's theory.
Right. The idea is that if a resource is shared by everyone, like a public grazing pasture or a global fishery individual, humans will act in their own rational self-interest and just overexploit the resource. If I don't catch all these fish, my neighbor will, so I better take as much as I can.
Yep, the race to the bottom.
And the result is the total destruction of the shared resource. How does this blueprint avoid that inevitability?
Well, the tragedy of the commons framework, which was popularized by Garrett Hardin in the 1960s, assumes that human beings are strictly selfish, hyper-rational actors operating in an absolute vacuum.
Meaning no communication.
Right, no community rules, no communication, no foresight. But decades of economic research, most notably by Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, proved that the tragedy is not actually inevitable.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Ostrom documented thousands of communities around the world that have successfully managed shared forests, water systems, and pastures for centuries without depleting them and without privatizing them.
How did they do it without a corporation or a state taking ownership to enforce the rules?
Their robust, localized governance, they treated the resource as shared wealth to be actively stewarded, not as a free-for-all commodity. They established clear boundaries, local monitoring, graduated sanctions for rule breakers, and democratic conflict resolution.
So it's heavily managed, just managed by the people using it.
Exactly. And the blueprint in item 25 scales this concept up.
Let's ground this. Contrast a privatized model against this managed commons model using a real-world resource. Let's use water as the classic example.
Okay, water. In a linear, highly privatized model, a multinational beverage corporation might purchase the extraction rights to a local water aquifer.
Right.
Their fiduciary duty is to their shareholders, not to the local ecosystem. So they pump millions of gallons, package it in single-use plastics, ship it globally, and realize a massive financial profit.
And the local community?
The local community is left with a depleted water table, agricultural failure, and the environmental burden of the plastic waste. The wealth is extracted and exported, but the ecological cost is localized.
And under the restorative economy?
Under item 25, that aquifer is an inalienable part of the commons. It cannot be privatized or liquidated for external shareholder profit because it is a fundamental component of the local social foundation and the planetary boundary.
So no one owns it?
The local community governs the extraction rate collectively to ensure it never exceeds the natural recharge rate of the aquifer.
And the manifesto goes beyond physical resources, too. It explicitly categorizes knowledge as a common good that must be protected.
Which is the linchpin that makes the cosmolocal manufacturing model work.
Oh, right. The blueprints.
Yeah. If a brilliant engineer invents a new, highly efficient water filtration system, but a corporation locks that design behind a 20-year patent wall, then a local community in a developing nation cannot legally 3D print it to solve a cholera outbreak.
They'd be sued.
They are forced to buy the physical product at a premium from the monopoly holder.
So by treating critical knowledge medical formulations, ecological technologies, agricultural data as part of the global commons, you ensure that reasonable sufficiency doesn't mean technological stagnation or deprivation.
Exactly.
You don't need to personally own the R&D lab if you have open access to humanity's shared operating system.
Precisely. It creates a massive pool of shared wealth that everyone can draw from, which reinforces the psychology of aparigraha. You don't feel the panic to hoard resources if you inherently trust that the commons will provide for you when a need arises.
Okay, this is a beautiful philosophical architecture. We have cradle-to-cradle physical engineering, a cosmological data-driven supply chain, an enlightened culture of reasonable sufficiency, and robustly managed commons.
It's quite the vision.
It sounds great on paper, but we have to descend from the clouds here. You cannot run a complex global civilization on good vibes and philosophical treatises. You need brutal, hard accounting principles.
You really do.
How does an economy actually execute this on a day-to-day basis without the entire system just grinding to a halt?
This is the critical transition in the text. This is what I call the hard mathematics of peace. To make these philosophical pillars a reality, Item 25 introduces 3 strictly defined mechanical tools: true cost accounting, conversion, and SROI, which stands for social return on investment.
Let's start with true cost accounting, because reading to the text, this seems to be the absolute wrecking ball of the restorative economy. It is the mechanism that forces everything else to change.
It really is the enforcement arm of the blueprint.
Yeah.
The Manifesto mandates that the price tag on any product or service must accurately reflect its social and ecological footprint.
Okay.
Because right now we operate in an economy defined by externalized costs.
Let's drill deep into externalized costs, because the macroeconomic implications of changing this are staggering.
Sure. Think about when you buy a fast fashion t-shirt for $5. That price reflects the cost of the raw cotton, the poverty-level wages of the garment worker, the shipping fuel, and the retail markup.
Right, the immediate costs.
But the actual cost of producing that shirt is much, much higher. There is the cost of the toxic dyes dumped into the river system in the manufacturing country, which destroys the local fishery.
Right.
There is the respiratory illness in the local population caused by the factory emissions. There is the atmospheric damage of shipping it across the Pacific. And there's the municipal cost of managing it in a landfill when it is thrown away after 3 washes.
And the corporation producing the shirt doesn't pay a dime for the dead fishery, the healthcare costs, or the landfill management. Those are real hard financial burdens, but they are externalized.
Exactly.
They are shifted off the corporate ledger and just dumped onto society, local governments, and future generations. The $5 price tag is essentially a lie subsidized by ecological destruction.
True cost accounting forces the internalization of those externalities. It takes the receipt for the dead fishery, the carbon emissions, and the landfill processing, and it slaps it directly onto the price tag of the t-shirt. The price must tell the absolute truth about the product's impact.
But wait, if we implement true cost accounting globally tomorrow, the macroeconomic fallout would be violent.
Oh, it would be a massive shock.
That $5 fast fashion t-shirt suddenly costs $60. A cheap plastic toy from a big box store costs $100 because the carbon and end-of-life disposal costs are factored in. A gallon of gas might cost $20. Doesn't this immediately violate the very first principle of the donut model?
The social foundation.
Yes, the social foundation for all. If you price in the ecological footprint, you cause massive inflation and immediately price the lower and middle classes out of existence. How does the Manifesto justify this?
It is the most common and pertinent critique of environmental economics, absolutely. But you cannot view true cost accounting in a vacuum. It is deeply symbiotic with the cosmological and cradle-to-cradle concepts we discussed earlier.
Okay, how so?
Under the logic of Item 25, true cost is not a permanent punishment for the consumer. It is a transitional weapon used to bankrupt the linear economy.
Walk me through that sequence. How does the market respond when a $5 shirt becomes $60?
If an ecologically destructive item becomes economically unviable to purchase, demand plummets.
Yeah.
The fast fashion corporation's business model completely collapses.
Right.
But people still need clothes. This massive vacuum in the market forces capital and innovation to flood into the alternative.
The cosmological alternative.
Exactly. The imported toxic t-shirt is $60, but a t-shirt produced locally from regenerative hemp, dyed with non-toxic biological agents, designed to be completely compostable, that shirt has almost 0 externalized costs. Its ecological footprint is negligible. Therefore, its true cost is almost identical to its base manufacturing cost. It might cost $10.
Oh, wow. So it weaponizes the free market against itself. It doesn't rely on asking corporations nicely to stop polluting.
Yep.
By mathematically pricing the pollution into the ledger, it makes the destructive business model totally unprofitable and clears the field for the sustainable model to dominate on purely economic grounds.
The transition period would undoubtedly be turbulent. It would completely upend global trade flows. Developing nations that currently leverage cheap labor and lax environmental laws as their primary economic advantage would face a massive shock.
I mean, entire national economies would have to pivot.
The blueprint acknowledges this, which is why the transition to a well-being economy requires global cooperation and massive wealth transfers to ensure the social foundation is maintained during the upheaval.
And that brings us to the next practical pillar, which deals directly with reallocating massive amounts of capital and industrial capacity. Conversion.
Yes, conversion.
The text explicitly calls for the transformation of military production facilities.
Think about the sheer scale and tonnage of the global military-industrial complex. We are talking about trillions of dollars in capital, the most advanced engineering talent on Earth, massive supply chains of steel and rare earth metals, and vast manufacturing infrastructures.
Almost unfathomable.
The Manifesto argues that an economy structured around preparing for violent destruction is the ultimate linear sinkhole. It consumes vast resources to produce weapons that either sit unused in silos or are deployed to actively destroy human and physical capital.
So conversion is the mandate to physically retool that infrastructure. You don't just shut the factories down and put millions of machinists out of work. You redirect the industrial capacity.
And the engineering overlaps are surprisingly robust. The text specifically highlights the creation of dual-use technologies and life-saving tech.
What does that look like practically? How does a defense contractor pivot?
A factory complex designed to mass-produce armored personnel carriers already possesses the heavy metallurgy, the robotic assembly lines, and the logistics networks required for large-scale manufacturing.
Right. They know how to build heavy vehicles efficiently.
Under the conversion mandate, that factory is retooled to produce fleet-scale, autonomous, solar-powered water purification vehicles for disaster relief zones.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Or a facility that builds advanced radar for targeting systems is converted to produce high-resolution, localized weather mapping arrays to predict climate catastrophes and optimize agricultural yields.
They are essentially turning the machinery of state-on-state war into the machinery of planetary defense and ecological resilience. Beating swords into plowshares, but on a multi-trillion-dollar industrial scale.
That's a great way to summarize it.
But again, I have to look at the friction here. The military industry is obscenely profitable under current accounting models. Defense contractors have fiduciary duties to generate massive returns for their shareholders. How do you convince Wall Street to finance a factory making water purifiers if the margins are a fraction of what they get from selling fighter jets?
Well, you cannot convince them under the current rules of finance.
Obviously not.
Which is why the final and perhaps most revolutionary piece of the mathematical puzzle must be implemented: SROI, or social return on investment, combined with the concept of peace capital.
Let's break down SROI. How does it alter the fundamental algorithm of investment?
Traditional ROI, return on investment, is completely one-dimensional. It asks a single question. If an investor puts $1 million into this project, how many millions do they get out in financial profit? SROI expands the ledger. It asks, if an investor puts $1 million into this project, what is the measurable social, ecological, and community value created alongside any financial return?
I need a concrete ledger example here. How do you quantify this?
Let's look at a municipal investment decision. Option A is subsidizing a massive new luxury shopping mall. The traditional financial ROI is high. The city anticipates a surge in retail sales tax, short-term construction jobs, and increased property values in the immediate vicinity.
Standard urban development stuff.
Option B is subsidizing a network of community-owned solar microgrids and localized fabrication labs. The direct financial ROI for option B might be much lower and the payback period much longer.
Under standard capitalist metrics, the shopping mall wins every single time.
It does, but under an SROI framework, the accountants must mathematically calculate and monetize the systemic outcomes.
Okay, so factoring in everything.
Yes. For option B, they calculate the long-term financial savings of the city's reduced carbon emissions. They calculate the economic value of grid resilience. How much money is saved by local businesses not losing power during a severe storm?
Oh, wow, right.
They calculate the increased earning potential of citizens who learn advanced manufacturing skills in the local fab labs.
The manifesto goes even deeper than that, though. It states that SROI must specifically measure a project's contribution to peace capital.
Yes, peace capital.
And they define peace capital as trust, security, and cooperation. How on earth does an actuary put a mathematical value on a concept like trust?
It sounds abstract, but sociologists and macroeconomists actually have sophisticated models for this. Trust has immense financial value.
Really?
Yes. In a high-trust society, transaction costs plummet. If people trust each other and their institutions, you don't need to spend billions of dollars on complex litigation, bloated corporate compliance departments, or massive private security apparatuses.
That makes a lot of sense.
High trust correlates with lower crime rates, which drastically reduces the municipal burden of policing and incarceration. It correlates with better public health outcomes, lowering the strain on the medical system.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the manifesto is arguing that a project that increases community trust, say a cooperative housing project or a shared agricultural commons, generates massive systemic financial value that traditional accounting completely ignores because it doesn't show up as immediate cash flow.
Exactly. By legally adopting SROI as the standard metric for both public and private investment, the entire incentive structure of the global economy is rewired.
It changes what money chases.
Exactly. Capital naturally flows away from extractive, divisive projects because their true cost makes them unviable, and flows powerfully toward projects that build social cohesion and ecological health, because those projects now mathematically demonstrate the highest returns.
It is taking the ruthless, cold efficiency of a corporate spreadsheet and reprogramming the core algorithm to optimize for human flourishing instead of cash extraction. It's brilliant, but the scale of the transition is almost dizzying.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
Let me try to synthesize this incredibly dense journey we've taken through item 25. The authors of this blueprint have presented a deeply complex adaptive system. We started with the diagnosis. The linear take-make-dispose economy, the shark that must keep swimming, is driving us headfirst into hard planetary boundaries.
Right.
To survive, we need to transition to the donut model, securing a social foundation for every human without breaching ecological limits.
But the blueprint makes it clear that you cannot achieve that without fundamentally altering the physical reality of production.
Right. You need cosmolocalism sharing knowledge globally to produce locally, and cradle-to-cradle design, ensuring every product is either a biological nutrient that heals the earth or a technical nutrient that is infinitely recycled. But that engineering architecture will collapse under the weight of human greed if we don't undergo a cognitive shift. We need the culture of a paragraha, reasonable sufficiency, where we find true autonomy by stepping off the manufactured consumer treadmill, and where we protect vital knowledge and resources within the commons to prevent the tragedy of privatization.
And finally, none of that is possible without rewriting the hard math of civilization.
The spreadsheets.
Right. You need true cost accounting to force the market to abandon polluting practices. You need conversion to retool the military-industrial complex toward planetary defense. And you need SROI to direct the flow of capital toward projects that generate peace, capital, trust, security, and cooperation.
It is a breathtakingly ambitious piece of architecture. You pull one string in item 25 and it tugs on everything from the design of a smartphone to the psychology of advertising, right down to the fundamental formulas of corporate accounting.
I would encourage you to take these abstract concepts and use them as a lens to observe your own life this week. Look around your home, your workplace, your neighborhood. Where do you vividly see the friction of the linear economy?
Yeah, pay attention to that.
Notice the frustration when an appliance is designed to be unrepairable, or the subtle anxiety of accumulating things you don't actually need just to keep up appearances. And conversely, look for the green shoots of this restorative economy.
Where do you see sufficiency or circularity already at play?
Maybe it's a localized community garden, a tool-sharing library, an open-source software project you contribute to, or simply the deep peace of mind that comes from deciding that you finally have enough. Notice how these different paradigms make you feel.
That is a fantastic exercise. It takes this massive global blueprint and brings it right down to the scale of a living room. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought. A question that builds entirely on the implications of everything we've just discussed. Something to mull over while you're commuting or cooking dinner tonight.
I'm intrigued.
If, as this manifesto suggests, humanity actually manages to engineer this transition. Let me rephrase that.
Right.
If we successfully build a positive-sum civilization where success is measured by the health of our ecosystems and the depth of trust in our communities, rather than by the sheer volume of material we consume, what happens to the concept of status?
Oh, that's a profound question.
Think about it. In our current linear world, we signal our worth, our place in the hierarchy,
Right.
almost entirely through consumption. The brand of the car we drive, the square footage of our home, the exclusivity of the things we can afford to buy and eventually throw away.
Right.
But in a culture defined by aperigrapha, a society where hoarding is viewed not as a marker of success, but as a symptom of psychological insecurity and systemic failure, how will you signal who you are to the world? When your human worth is no longer tied to the destructive output of a linear economy, what will be the new currency of respect?
Something very different, I imagine.
It's something profound to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly extensive deep dive into the architecture of a restorative economy. Until next time, keep questioning the blueprint.